Hello and welcome. My name is Quinn Reed, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board. I'd like to welcome you to the Dole Institute of Politics on this wonderful May day, and thank you for attending today's presentation. The Dole Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the work of the Dole Institute. We attend regular meetings, assist in events like this, and plan an SAB-sponsored program every semester. Members of the SAB receive great opportunities to network with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you. If you enjoyed this afternoon's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. If you prefer to write us a note, there will be a notepad and pens on a table as you exit the building. Your attendance and feedback help shape future programming. Before we begin today, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview at the end of the program, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and I will be by with a microphone to answer your question. Please ask just one brief question. And now, please welcome the Director of the Department of Military History, Jim Welbanks.
Thank you. I'd like to echo Quinn's welcome to you and appreciate you coming out in this, whatever this weather is here. It is spring according to the calendar. It's my pleasure to introduce John House, who will be the fourth speaker in this series looking at particular aspects of World War II. All of the presenters are from the Department of Military History at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. John is the William A. Stoft History Chair. He has a specialty on World War II, combined arms warfare, and has a book out recently on the Cold War. And you have his bio there, so I won't take any more of his time. So without further ado, John.
Thank you. Of course, what Dr. Wilbanks always forgets to mention is one of my highest achievements is having taught him when he went to the Staff College 30 years ago, but we won't talk about that, right? Any event, what I would like to talk to you about today is a problem that we have in history, and that is for three generations, or well, three decades, I guess I should say at least, after World War II, we didn't know how the Soviets defeated the Germans. I say the Soviets. I'm not belittling anything that any other allies did against the Axis, but the fact is that 8 out of every 11 German casualties was suffered fighting the Soviets. And yet, as I said, we really didn't know very much about it. Why didn't we know about it? Well, because of this man and people like him. Franz Halder, the chief of the German Army General Staff during the glory years, was relieved by Hitler in the fall of '42 when things started to go bad. And after the war, he and a large number of other generals and colonels were arrested by us, first of all, imprisoned by us, and eventually we put them on the payroll and asked them to write their recollections, in most cases without records, I might point out, their recollections of what happened from their point of view. So that when we wrote the U.S. official history of World War II, we had both sides, which is really what you need to do do a good history. I don't see how we're ever going to get that for, say, Afghanistan. We're never going to find out what the other side really thought, right? Any event, when we asked them to do this, they did pretty much what we wanted, but we sort of forgot the process involved. Franz Halder sort of appointed himself the unofficial editor, and everybody's manuscript, before it was turned in to us, he sort of put spin on it, made sure it all gave us a common viewpoint of what was going on. It wasn't that the Germans were lying to us, but they were telling us their perceptions, their recollections, which was not necessarily reality. And once they started doing this, I mean, the Germans are so friendly and so professional, and the Soviets in those days of the Cold War were so suspicious and standoffish that it was very natural of us to believe what the Germans told us. And so the Germans gave us their sort of alibi version of how we lost the war, despite the fact we're the greatest army in the world. You know, we all still today, we spend all our time studying the German army, even though they're 0 for 2. And so we need to then sort of look at first what they said and then why there may be some problems with their explanations for it. And the first thing you got to recognize is that there's three sort of what I like to call alibis. Sometimes when I'm being blunt with myself, I call them lies, but they weren't deliberately lies. Three explanations that the Germans give to themselves. And all of you know enough about your own lives to know that we tend to rearrange facts in our memory so that it fits things nicely and it makes us more comfortable. It's not necessarily the truth, but we all are guilty of it to some degree or another. And what the Germans said basically was, first of all, that idiot Hitler. Secondly, the severe weather and terrain of the Soviet Union. And thirdly, the fact that they were simply overwhelmed by the Soviet numbers. Well, I want to focus really on that third one, the question of numbers, because obviously, yes, the Soviets did outnumber them, but I want to talk to you about some ways in which I think the Germans perhaps sort of were misled or exaggerated how much that was. But before we get to talking about numbers, let's talk briefly about these first two. First thing we all have to recognize, and I'm sure you're aware of this, is that Adolf Hitler is the universal alibi for everything that happened in Germany for 12 years. You'd think there was no one else alive or making any decisions in Germany. It's all Adolf Hitler, Adolf Hitler, Adolf Hitler. And I have no doubt that in recollection that's the way they remember it. Let me ask you as a start, and I apologize for doing this, but I think you'll see the point when you get done. I'm going to show you two rather long quotations, one after the other. They're both from Field Marshal Manstein, who is lionized in the West. He published his memoirs as soon as we let him out of prison for war crimes, and they were translated instantly, became a bestseller, and they are sort of what we all rely upon to a certain extent, and they reflect what a lot of German memoirs told us about what happens. So let me ask you to just read the first one. I'll allow a certain amount of time, then we'll go on to the second slide. You with me? This one's kind of longer and therefore the type is smaller. I apologize. Now, I venture to say that even if you've never read Manstein, you have read ideas like this, okay? As I said, what he's saying, if you want to boil it down, is if that amateur Hitler had only allowed his professional officers to run things, we would have at least fought to a draw and maybe even defeated the Red Army. Well, I'm no big fan of Adolf Hitler. Obviously, he is a genocidal maniac. Let's not make two ways about it. But there's a number of problems with this argument, and we need to talk about them. First of all, most of the time, Adolf Hitler did what his commanders recommended. We tend to forget that. They talk about the times where he disagreed with them. We'll get to them in a moment. But throughout 1943, in some cases, and I'll give you an example, even in 1944, Adolf Hitler did what the commanders told him was the smart thing to do, even if he didn't necessarily agree with it. But as I said, we all sort of conveniently forget our responsibility in these things, right? For example, the German officer corps, by and large, was very much in support of invading the Soviet Union in 1941. They believed, as did Hitler, that they could defeat the Soviet army and the Soviet state in a matter of weeks. One good, swift kick and it'll all be over, was the attitude. And they therefore didn't really have any problem. As a matter of fact, it is the commander of the German army, Brauchitsch, who actually urges Hitler to start planning to invade Russia before they've even fought the Battle of Britain in 1940. I'm not saying Hitler wouldn't have arrived at the same idea himself, but I'm saying they're fully involved in this thing. The only people who didn't agree with that in the German army, in the German general staff, were the logisticians, the supply guys. And I'm sure you have all heard enough to know that that's sort of a cliche in the military that amateurs talk about tactics and professionals talk about logistics. In this case, the logisticians knew what they were doing, but nobody listened, as usual. In the fall of 1940, after they'd studied this problem, they said, not so much. And basically, the argument they said, and was remarkably prescient, the head of logistics, if you will, the G4 of the German army said, look, what's going to happen is we'll get about 500 miles, 800 kilometers into Russia, and we'll run out of fuel and ammunition. And at that point, the roads are so terrible, and the railroads will all have to be rebuilt because, as you perhaps know, the German railroads are at a narrower gauge than the Russian railroads. And we're just simply not going to be able to support you in your great blitzkrieg maneuvers after the first 2 months. And so after that, it's going to be start-stop. You're going to have to wait for the supplies and the infantry, by the way, to catch up with your tanks, and then lunge forward again, run out of supplies again, start-stop, start-stop, start-stop. And that's pretty much is what described the next 2 years. They were absolutely on the money about it. As far as I know, nobody ever allowed Adolf Hitler to hear this explanation. It was our friend Franz Halder, the chief of the German General Staff, who basically said, well, forget about it, we'll fake it. But again, we all have our sort of selective memories. And 2 years later, some of the generals had second thoughts. Guderian, Walter Model were not at all happy, but most of the generals were still saying attack, attack, attack. And I'm referring here to what perhaps many of you know about the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front is the attack on the Kursk Bulge in July of 1943. And at that time, they were all in favor of it. Adolf Hitler was sort of saying, why are we doing this? I'm not quite sure what the point of all this is. But he went along with the generals anyhow and let them attack. And it was the first time the Blitzkrieg sort of failed to launch. It never got through to the breakthrough stage, so we never really had a chance to do all their great maneuvers that they were planning on. If you even get down to sort of the lower level, you can find that the professionals often made mistakes as well. I'm going to give you just one example, but I'm sure we could think of others if we tried. Most of you are perhaps aware that in November of 1942, the Red Army encircled the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. And there is a legend out there that Hermann Goering, well-known drug addict and head of the Luftwaffe, promised Hitler that they would resupply the Sixth Army by air until he relieved it. The problem with that is that Adolf Hitler and Hermann Goering weren't even in the same country for 10 days after the Soviets encircled Stalingrad. Goering was back in Germany doing all the other functions that Hitler had given him as number two. And it wasn't Goering, it was his professional chief of staff, General Hans Jonathon, the chief of staff of the Luftwaffe, who said, yes, mein Führer, I think we can resupply Stalingrad. Now, I must tell you, in his defense, that Jonathon went and looked at the facts and talked to the local people that night and said, we can't do it. Went back and tried to convince Hitler otherwise. And eventually, Jonathon committed suicide. I'm not saying that was the cause. I think it was actually another cause. But I don't want to say that he is totally, the villain here. My point is simply that people make mistakes. But we only remember when Hitler makes mistakes. The other part about this, as I said, is that sometimes when Hitler didn't follow what their advice, he wasn't always wrong and they weren't always right. Hitler sort of instinctively figured out very early in the war that this war was going to drag on. It was going to be an attritional war rather than a quick blitzkrieg, and therefore he started to focus on economic targets like getting the oil fields in son of a gun Chechnya. Why do we keep talking about Chechnya today? And places like that. Whereas his commanders were still thinking in sort of the traditional terms. His commanders were saying, well, if we only capture Moscow, if we only capture Leningrad, we'll succeed. Well, how? We can go back and look. Napoleon in 1812 captured Moscow. Did the Soviets or the Russians at that time surrender? No. So to some extent, Hitler's right. And one of the classic examples, of course, of Hitler being right, maybe for the wrong reasons, but still he turns out to be right, is on the outskirts of Moscow in 1941. The Soviets launch a relatively weak counterattack. The German commanders, who are already overstretched because of their logistics, decide we can't go any farther. And they want to retreat. And Hitler says, no, stay right where you are. Now, you can argue that's a World War I corporal thinking, don't give up the trench. And maybe you're right, but the fact is that if you go look at the circumstances, had the Germans retreated, they would have had to give up all of the shelter that they had. They really would have literally frozen to death. So Hitler made the right decision and probably saved the German army in the process, or at least what was left of it. In any event, next we talk about weather and terrain. Well, doesn't that affect both sides? Shouldn't they have known this was coming? Another one of the great myths of 1941 is that the Germans did not have any winter clothing. They did have winter clothing, maybe not enough for everybody, but for, several 100,000 guys. The problem wasn't that they didn't have the clothing, the problem was they couldn't deliver it to the troops. Because remember what I said about the logisticians saying, hey, your railroads aren't going to work, we can't do this logistically? Well, it became obvious. The farther they got away from Poland and the closer they got to Moscow, the harder it was to resupply. In the beginning of November 1941, not Adolf Hitler, but the chiefs of staff of the 3 German army groups, in other words, 3 general staff officers, decided, well, we don't have enough transportation to move both the winter clothing and the food and ammo. The troops need ammo, fuel, food. We're going to have to wait on the clothing. But that's not the way the history is usually told, is it? Okay, so much then for sort of this background. I guess I should show you just briefly, for those of you not familiar, I'm going to just click this through so you get some sense of the thing. This is what the campaign looks like for the first couple of months. They reached Smolensk, which is, surprisingly enough, about 700 kilometers from where they jumped off, and son of a gun, they ran out of fuel. And they had to stop and sort of start, and from there on. By that time, they had an open flank down to the south towards Kiev, so they had to cut that off. And for the rest of the time, they're living hand to mouth from there on. But let's talk about numbers. First thing we have to recognize is that Germans did not complain about being outnumbered when they were winning. Even in 1941, the Red Army outnumbered them by 4-3 in manpower, 3-1 in aircraft, about 3.5-1 to tanks. And in fact, in the first year of the war, first 6 months of the war, the Red Army suffered 4.5 million men killed, wounded, and captured. That's 150% of the size of the invading force from the Axis. So it's not about just being outnumbered. It's about the other advantages the Germans have. Not only did they achieve strategic surprise, and we could spend all night talking about why Stalin was surprised, let's not, please. But not only were they surprised strategically, but also the Soviet army was caught in transition. They were changing their leaders, their organization, their doctrine, their training, their locations for defense plans. Everything was in flux just when the Germans chose to attack. The Germans could not have chosen in the short run a better time to attack. And that is the reason, the principal reason why they were so successful. Now, a year later, you fast forward to the middle of 1942, and by that time, it's been sort of the Darwin Awards. Those surviving Soviet commanders know what they're doing. And suddenly, the Germans are not nearly so successful when they launch operations. I'm not saying the Red Army always gets things right, but certainly that they're not the bunch of stumble bumps they were for the first 6 months or a year. And therefore, but the Germans don't want to recognize that that advantage is what gave them such a great deal that they were able to succeed. They can't sort of, it's built into their minds. Indeed, what I'm trying to suggest here is that the generals like Manstein, at the beginning of the war, got it into their heads that we're so much better than the Russians that they never bothered to reassess their opinion later on in the war. And it's sort of natural, first impressions and all that other stuff. We defeated this team last year, so we're going to expect to defeat them this year, not realizing that, yeah, maybe they've changed as much as we have, right? Overall, the second fallacy is not so much that they're outnumbered. They knew they were outnumbered, didn't they? They must have. But rather the belief that on part of the Germans that it really didn't matter. It doesn't matter that we're outnumbered. We're still so good we can defeat the enemy so rapidly that numbers don't matter. I seem to remember something like that in 2003, but let's not go there, right? And it works in the short run. It just doesn't work in the long run. Any event, Germany, in fact, is the poster child for what we like to call the Western way of war. The idea that a well-trained force can achieve rapid, offensive, decisive victory by superior discipline, maneuver, and equipment. Well, that works part of the time. But if you encounter somebody who is not willing to say he's defeated, as the Soviets were not, and then you encounter somebody who, in addition to that, has all that vast terrain, then eventually your plan gets thwarted and forced Germany into a long, drawn-out attritional war that they certainly simply weren't prepared for. They were set for the short, sweet, let's get it over with war, which is what Blitzkrieg was all about. And instead, they got the 4-year grinding war of annihilation and wonder why we have problems. Well, okay, let's talk about the numbers here. First of all, sort of at the big picture level, the Soviet Union's population, and there's a lot of ifs about these figures, was twice that of Germany to begin with. More than that, the Soviet Union has an enormous advantage in terms of trained reservists, trained military manpower. At the time that the Germans attacked, there were about 5 million men on active duty in the Soviet military, but there were 14 million reservists who'd been through 2 years of training available to use to build up the army when you needed to make replacements and so on. By contrast, you look at the Germans, well, the German Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht together total about 7 million in 1941, of which a little over 3 million were actually on the Eastern Front. But there's no reservists. There are 321,000 men who just finished basic training in May that are available for replacements, and that's it. And they ran through that many casualties in the first 3 months. Why didn't the Germans have reservists? Well, 2 problems. First of all, Germany is proportionally much more industrialized than the Soviet Union, so therefore they need the very highly educated, skilled people. The very guys you want to be your leaders and your technicians in the army are also the people you want to keep in the factories. And indeed, some of you know that the Germans went back and forth. They would mobilize for a particular campaign, and then a couple of months later they released people back to go back to the factories because their employers, the factory owners, are complaining. As a matter of fact, sort of an idea of how unrealistic the Germans were about this, on the 21st of May, 1941, the OKW operations staff, that is what we would call the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I guess we'd say, issued a memo to the German industrialists saying, we only intend to keep your workers on active duty for 4 months, from the 1st of June to the 30th of September. In other words, the Germans really thought they could defeat the Soviet Union and demobilize in 4 months. Oops, didn't work that way, did it? Secondly, the bigger problem is it says up there is the Versailles Peace Treaty. Some of you may remember this, if only from high school. The Versailles Peace Treaty imposed on Germany at the end of World War I, and it limited the German army to 100,000 men, all of whom were enlisted for no less than 12 years. That was deliberately done to make sure that the Germans would not have reservists. Okay? Now, did they cheat on the edge? Of course they did. Did Hitler start telling them to secretly do a little training on the side as soon as he took office in 1933? Yes, he did. But basically for about 12 years, from say 1920 to 1932, the Germans don't get to train any of the young men who are coming of age, any of the 18-year-olds. They're called the white years or the blank years in German history. And so this whole system of training reservists and banking them for future needs broke down. Then when they did start training in 1935, they openly began drafting people again and said the heck with the Versailles Peace Treaty. When they did that, they found that they didn't have enough barracks and enough weapons and enough ammunition to train with because Germany had shortages of ammunition and raw materials, and they, just as with the U.S. Army in 1940 to 42, which you've heard stories about how, training with broomsticks and things like this, the same thing sort of applies to the Germans. If you don't have the weapons, the equipment, and the ammunition, you can't train the people. Under those circumstances, prior to 1941, the Germans never had the training space, the bunks in the barracks, if you will, to go back and train those blank years. A very few people, if they were technicians, let's say electronics guys, or somebody you really needed, would almost as a favor be given 3 months of basic training, and that's it. So Germany was not able to sort of bank reservists for the future the way it had done for a century before. Even the age groups that they did draft were under strength, undersized. Why? Well, think about it. If you draft an 18-year-old in 1936, when was he born? 1918. Conceived in 1917. What's going on in Germany in 1917-18? They're being blockaded and starved to death. And not only that, most of the young men are off at the front, not getting home to see their girlfriends or wives very often anyhow. So you can imagine there are relatively fewer births there than there would be in an ordinary year. More than that, as it says down there in that bottom bullet, they're really short of leaders. Everybody likes to talk about how well-trained the 100,000-man Reichswehr was. Well, how far does 94,000 guys, because they had to give 6,000 to the Air Force, Luftwaffe, how far did 94,000 guys go to provide the cadre for an army of 7 or 8 million eventually? Not very far, right? So where do they find those cadres? They have to go back to the veterans of World War I. And the first sergeants and company commanders and battalion commanders in 1939-40, even going into Russia in 1941, they're all in their 40s. They're all veterans of World War I. There are 500,000 World War I veterans in the combat units of the German Army in 1941. And back at home, they got some of the staff officers running the training operation are 70 years old. And it only gets worse from there. So, you know, if some people like to say, well, the Germans are just so good at this that it doesn't matter that the Soviets have got more trained reservists because they're all over age and badly trained. Well, maybe so, but I'm trying to suggest to you that the Germans have much the same problem. They run out of people really fast. Their training has to get shorter and shorter and shorter because they need the guys sent to the front. And so they really don't have the people anymore. If anything, they have far less chance for leadership and so on than the Soviets do. Okay, so much for sort of big, broad generalizations. Let me talk briefly then about some big issues of why the Germans would think they had more enemies than they really did. First is something that is sort of a convention of intelligence, and that is you always assume your enemy is at full strength unless you're absolutely sure he's not. You don't want to underestimate him. So you assume that he's got 100% strength. If you doubt me, I was in the room when the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency decided to do just that about Iraq in 1990 before we invaded them. We have to assume that 100% of the tanks and 100% of the men are there. So if you compare the enemy's ideal strength to your own actual strength, and you know that somebody's in the hospital, somebody's home, somebody's, broke his leg or whatever, you're inevitably going to exaggerate how strong the enemy is compared to you. True? Secondly, we tend to think of these huge numbers of forces on a single battlefield, but in fact they're not. There's a little thing called terrain gets in the way. Take, for example, some of you may have heard the word Prokhorovka, by reputation the largest tank battle ever in history. 4 German high-priority mechanized divisions versus 5 Soviet tank corps in July of 1943. Well, it happened, but it actually happened on 4 different battlefields. No one of those battlefields had more than 600 tanks. That's still a lot of tanks, I grant you. But it's not the vast vestiges of endless troops and tanks that we sort of imagine in our memories and you sometimes see in the movies. It just didn't happen that way. Thirdly, it's worth noting that in many cases the Germans were defeated not by actual numbers, but by phantom numbers, by deception plans, shadow armies that the Soviets portrayed as being there that weren't really there. This is called maskirovka. You can see the word mask in it, right? The Soviet doctrine is you combine deception operations to portray something that isn't real with operation security to hide what is real, so the other guy doesn't know what you're really doing. Were the Germans always tricked? No. They usually figured it out, but they didn't figure it out in time. And so therefore they were often fighting against imaginary enemies. They would concentrate their troops in the wrong place and things like this. Let me give you sort of 2 brief examples in the interest of time. One I don't have a map for, but I think you can visualize it very clear. weird place in western Ukraine on the Dnieper River called Korsun-Shevchenkovsky. I'm glad I didn't have a beer before I tried to do this, but anyhow. And Korsun-Shevchenkovsky happens to be on the boundary line between two Soviet fronts, that is, army groups of armies, huge organizations, and they've decided to cooperate with each other, and they want to encircle two German corps, maybe 50, 60,000 guys, right there at the intersection. It's obvious to the Germans too, so they're watching for it. So how do the Soviets trick them? Well, the commander of one of these fronts, Marshal Ivan Konyev, manages to make one of his main tools, his offensive striking force, the 5th Guards Tank Army, appear to be in two places at once. How? Well, first he has them attack about 100 kilometers south of where they really plan to attack. And after they made a local little attack, and so the Germans know they're there, they then put in all those deception measures you remember hearing about with relation to tricking the Germans at Normandy. You know, dummy tanks, fake radio conversations, lots of noise, things like that in the woods, to give the impression that 5th Guards Tank Army is still there. Meanwhile, the 5th Guards packs up and as silently as you can with 500 tanks, moves northward 30 or 35 kilometers in preparation for helping to encircle Korsun-Shevchenkovsky. Managed it twice. I better quit while I'm ahead. Any event, the Germans' 8th Army, the defenders, figured it out after 48 hours, but that 48-hour head start meant that the Germans were not ready to defend themselves when 5th Guards Tank Army came crashing in and ended the world for them. That's just one example of what I'm talking about. The most famous example, perhaps the largest example of deception, is something called Operation Bagration, sometimes known as the death of Army Group Center, on the 3rd anniversary of the war, 22 June 1944, which is my birthday. Why do all the disasters happen on my birthday? Anyhow, but on the June of 1944, Army Group Center pretty much gets wiped off the map. If you can look at this map here, you see where that solid red line bulges eastward to around Smolensk and Minsk. That's the sector of Army Group Center. It's an obvious target for the Soviets to attack, so the Soviets need to rig the deck. They, by their calculations, remember I told you it's all perceptions, they only outnumber the Germans by about 1 million to 850,000, which, you know, that's no advantage at all. If the enemy has 85% of what you do, that's not going to work. So they secretly move in another 400,000 troops, 3,000 tanks, 10,000 gun tubes, 40,000 tons of supplies, you know, just your average run-of-the-mill little logistical movement. They secretly move it in, and meanwhile, they are noisily pretending that they're going to attack where that dashed arrow is, down south, a notional attack into the Balkans. The commander down there in Army Group North Ukraine, Walter Model, is really tempted by this. He wants to believe it because it appears to give him an opportunity to do a counterattack. You don't have to be a military genius to figure out that, gee, I can just chop in from the north, so to speak, on that advance and attack their flank and destroy them. So Walter Model goes to Adolf Hitler. Notice it's not Hitler's idea. Remember what I said about blaming Hitler? Walter Model goes to Hitler's idea and convinces the Fuhrer that the 56th Panzer Corps, which is the main counterattack force for Army Group Center, should be moved south in preparation to attack this entirely imaginary Soviet front. And then when the Soviets attack as planned in the place that they wanted to up north, they destroyed 25 German divisions in about 2 weeks. Not good, right? That's sort of the kind of problems you have. Now, if we, and it's worth noting, by the way, that it all depends again on how you count things. The Soviets think they only outnumbered the Germans 2-1. But the U.S. official history, written on the basis of all those German accounts, says that the Soviets outnumbered the Germans there at 3.5-1. See what I mean about deceptions tricking everybody? Any event, we're going to sort of skip details because I don't want to spend all. One of the things you got to recognize, though, is that Soviet military science tends to focus on numbers and ratios. You aren't a good Soviet officer if you don't have tables and charts and graphs. Because you perhaps know that for a communist, Marxism is a science, not an art. And therefore, you got to have tables and graphs. You look at Karl Marx, there's 3 volumes of tables and graphs trying to prove his point. Well, okay. So whenever the Soviets looked at this stuff, they would always count what is the force ratio, what they would call the correlation of forces. How many gun tubes have I got per kilometer front versus how many does the enemy have? And I want to have, of course, overwhelming numbers. And that's the scientific way to do things. Let me back up to that map that I wanted to show you just really briefly, show you an example of this. You see that white line in the middle there where it goes from Minsk to Smolensk to Moscow? That's the Minsk-Moscow highway, one of the very few paved roads, an obvious place that the Soviets would like to get a hold of. The Germans understand that. They put an entire infantry division just straddling the road to defend it. However, the Soviets are darn well determined to break through. And so they concentrate on a 5-mile wide front, 5 divisions and a separate tank brigade against 1, perhaps slightly stronger German division. And there are 4 other places on the long front that you have the same kind of force ratio. Now, at that exact point, when the Germans tell you they're outnumbered hopelessly, yeah, that's true. But what they don't want to talk about is the deceptions involved, or the fact that in other places the Soviets have sort of stretched things out, what's called economy of force, put a few guys with a lot of machine guns and guns, artillery pieces, to pretend to be a much bigger unit so that you can, in fact, concentrate your forces where you want to. This is, in fact, part of Soviet doctrine. They had a doctrine before the war called deep operation, Globoky Operatsky, and their idea was, it was similar to Blitzkrieg. I'm not going to say they didn't learn something from the Germans, but they had their own ideas. And basically what they want to do is use rifle armies and artillery and air power to blow a hole in the enemy defenses, and then pass these very large combined arms mechanized forces, like our friend 5th Guards Tank Army, through it and exploit as far as, and keep running till the enemy cannot reorganize to defend himself, as deep as 400 kilometers. 400 kilometers, that's a long way, right? How do you do that? Well, it helps if you have 412,000 U.S. supplied Lend-Lease trucks, okay? They would not have been able to do it quite so easily without that. They would have had to, just like the Germans, they would have got a short distance and then run out of fuel and ammo and had to do it again. They probably would have won the war anyhow, but it would have been much longer and bloodier. So what I'm trying to suggest here is the Germans tend to talk to us about how outnumbered they were. Yeah, of course they were outnumbered, but what I suggest to you is that the Red Army is successful because of a combination of deception, concentration of force on a few narrow sectors, very rapid, deep exploitation so the enemy can't reorganize. And I already mentioned this next point, that the German commanders who were there in 1941-42, they're the guys whose memoirs we all read. Guderian, Mellenthin, Manstein, people like that. What about the commanders of 1943 to 45? Well, with one exception I can think of, they didn't get to write their memoirs because they're either dead or in Siberia in the prison camp for 10, 12 years. And so our view of the war is distorted. It's equivalent to, as I like to say, something like this. Supposing that we wanted to write a history of how well the U.S. Army did in World War II, and our basis for deciding how well the U.S. Army did in World War II is we're going to ask the Japanese and the Germans how well we fought in 1942 and early 43. And I don't think we'd come off looking too well out of this, okay? So, yeah, of course they're outnumbered, but they knew that coming up front, didn't they? And of course the Soviets like to emphasize numbers, so every time the Soviets publish another report full of tables, that tends to confirm our notion that they're outnumbered. But my point to you simply is it's not so much about being outnumbered at the strategic level, at the overall big picture. It's about the fact that the Red Army is able to deceive the enemy so they can outnumber them at a particular breakthrough point and then exploit from it. Thank you. You have the microphone. Anybody got questions? Or I already put you to sleep?
One point I thought you might have raised, at least, is that it, after all, was not just a German army that invaded the Soviet Union. It was a multinational army, and I think it was an army that was very difficult to coordinate in many ways. Part of this comes from family connection. My wife's father, in fact, from Slovakia, was on the Eastern Front, presumably fighting for the Germans or, supply capacity. I don't know which, but there was a bunch of Slovaks from the satellite state of Slovakia, and quite a few of those people never came home, as her father did not, and at least one uncle was badly wounded at the siege of Leningrad. So I think that that's a side of the war that is often somewhat slighted, that it was a lot of different nationalities involved, and I think that must have been in some ways a real headache for the commanders of trying to deal with all of these different nationalities. We do know that the Soviets at times tried to pick on, for example,
absolutely.
the Italians or the Romanians, or this kind of thing. They were very aware that their enemies were multinational, and so they tried to pick out the weaker ones. So I just wanted to add that point to you.
No, you're absolutely right. That's the other side of not having enough Germans, is they start getting their allies in. In terms of Slovaks, there was a Slovak regiment captured at Stalingrad. There was a Slovak sort of Panzer division, lightly equipped Panzer division down in the Caucasus trying to get the oil fields, and they were just about wiped out, and the survivors mutinied, so they were sent home. The Romanians proportionally suffered more casualties than the Germans did throughout the war. I mean, they took horrendous casualties. After Stalingrad, everybody but the Romanians pretty much went home. The Hungarians, I mean, that is to say, there were a few units left behind, but only the Romanians tried to reconstitute their units. Everybody else said, we've had enough, and they went home, having suffered enormous casualties. The Italians sent 220,000 to the flank outside of Stalingrad, and out of that 220,000, only 125,000 came home. And about 10,000 came home as prisoners 5 years later. And the rest of them are just all gone, lost. So you're absolutely right. And so then the Germans turn around and try to get the local nationalities. I'm just right now working on a master's thesis with my Latvian officer talking about the two Latvian divisions. So you're right, that's part of the problem. And then the Hungarians and Romanians would rather fight each other than fight the Soviets, for example. So they have to put the Italians in between them on the front.
How have the lessons learned from deception influenced today's use of psychological operations?
That's a good point. I'm not sure we can say this. In the 1980s, we were very fascinated with deception with Maskarovka. My mentor, David Glantz, has a whole book from which I stole those examples, to be honest with you, called Soviet Military Deception in World War II. I think the deception people have always looked at them, and the psychological operations people have looked at them to some extent, but I can't say that we cite those examples every day. This is still sort of an overlooked part of the war, although we know a lot more about it than we did 20, 30 years ago.
What effect did the invasion on the Western Front in France, so forth, in June and July of 44 have on the Eastern Front?
Two things. First of all, Hitler was always very nervous about having such a front, so that he kept a lot of troops in the West, which wasn't always bad. They could sort of go there to rest and rebuild. And so the very threat of that, even before it happened, obviously affects the East. Secondly, what happens is once the Allies invade, the Russians think they're in a competition. And so on a number of occasions, the Russians speed up and decide they're going to make their next attack and take casualties for it because they want to make sure they get to Berlin before the Allies. So yeah, there actually is some very large level coordination between the two. Like after the Battle of the Bulge, when the Germans attacked us, we asked the Soviets for help, so they speeded up their next attack by a couple of weeks to bail us out, and vice versa, okay? There's all kinds of hands here. I don't know. I think that gentleman's next, isn't he?
Thanks for coming. Did either side, the Germans or the Soviets, have an advantage in the air?
Good point. The Germans obviously had much more experience because they'd been flying and fighting since Spain in 1937. And they managed to catch the Soviets, as I said, as they're transitioning in aircraft, just as they're transitioning in tanks. It took a long, long time for the Red Army to get as good as the Germans. I'm not sure they ever were as good, but they didn't really become competitive till the end of 1942. Oddly enough, the argument I like to use is this, that the British and American bombing of Germany, whatever it did about industry, and you could debate that one all day, it caused the Germans to spend a lot of their fighters and a lot of their famous 88 millimeter anti-aircraft guns to bring them home to Germany to defend Germany, which indirectly helped the Soviets get air superiority earlier than they would have otherwise. But that's not in any manual for air power, is it?
How do you explain, despite all the shortcomings of the German army, that it took 4 years to be defeated?
Because they're very good. I didn't say they were not good. I just said that they were in a situation that fundamentally they were not capable of winning. Obviously, they were very good, and the Soviets did not always do things perfectly by any means. They didn't even really start to get their act together for the first year and a half of the war. But obviously, the Germans are very good, and also, of course, as you were saying earlier, they're allies. Their Axis satellites did a lot of fighting. The Germans didn't necessarily give them credit for that. The Germans sort of looked down on them because they were trained differently, not equipped very well. But they certainly did a lot of the fighting and dying process, yeah. So. No, I didn't mean to suggest the German army isn't good. I mean to suggest that we sometimes tend to exaggerate just how good it is. Because particularly in the Cold War, we thought, well, we'll do the same thing. We and the West German army will be able to stop the Soviets the same way the Germans slowed the Soviets down, okay?
I wonder if you could say a little bit about the purges of the 1930s and the impact that had on the Red Army High Command?
An enormous one. I sort of alluded to that by saying they were transitioning leadership. You're absolutely right. If you didn't perhaps understand what he's talking about, something on the order of 50% or more of all the commanders from colonel on up were purged by, as part of the great purges in the Soviet Union from 1937 to 1940-41. Then, when it became obvious that Germany was going to attack eventually, purge does not always mean executed. A lot of those poor guys were sent to the prisons in the gulags in Siberia and then let out. A favorite example of this is Marshal Rokossovsky. He was then a general who was basically arrested on suspicion, sent to Siberia, and in spring of 1941 they realized they need him, so they took him out of the prison camp, stopped off in Moscow to replace all his teeth because he'd lost them all. Think of Jaws in that movie, right? And sent him to the front to command a division. That's how desperate they were for leaders when they figured it out. But you're very right that they had lost a lot of their most experienced leaders and made everybody sort of hesitant. They would second guess themselves. You know, they're sort of looking over their shoulder to see if the secret police are there. By the middle of 1942, part of their recovery is that Stalin's learned to trust his generals, and he starts to give them more authority and more trust.
Thank you. I've always heard the technology of the Germans was significantly better than the Soviets in 1941. Is that true?
In 1941, no. In 1940, I think you have to say that the newest Soviet tanks were superior to what the Germans had. Now, when people talk about the technology of German tanks, they're usually talking about what I call the third generation, that is to say the Panthers, the Tigers, things like that are fielded in 1943. They have a certain amount of teething problems, but they are magnificent machines. The problem is that they are such an investment in manpower and labor to make this magnificent machine that they are outnumbered. The total number of Tiger tanks produced in World War II is equal to about 3 months of Soviet tank production of T-34s. And the war went on for 3.5 years. Okay, so yes, that's another one of those sort of myths that the Germans just simply were better at using what they had in 41, 42, until, as I said, the Soviets sort of overcame all their problems, including the purges, and then it became more of an even operation. And in many cases, the Soviets had better equipment, I think. It's really bad if you talk about the Axis. I mean, I happen to be reading a book about the Italians. They're still carrying a rifle designed in 1896, and they're fighting against the Soviets who have submachine guns. You just can't deal with that difference in firepower, you know?
My most vivid memories of the war, I was a child at the time, was late 44, the Battle of the Bulge.
Mm-hmm.
So that must have entailed a tremendous shift of material and manpower from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. Could you go into that a bit? What really happened there?
I think you put your finger on it, that Hitler, his hope was that he could repeat 1940, basically, that he could punch through the Allies in about the same area that they punched through the French in 1940, pin them back against the coastline in the Netherlands and Belgium and so on, and eliminate a large part of the force in the West so that then he could turn around and fight the Soviets. But, as you suggest, to do that, he took many of his very best units from the Eastern Front, from Hungary, as I recall specifically at that point, and sent them to the Western Front, and then they did not succeed. Not that they didn't do a good job, but they didn't have the same opportunities, and they did not succeed, and so in that case he probably speeded up his defeat in the East. But you can argue that's the kind of gamble that people like Manstein were begging him to do all the way during the war, and he didn't want to do it until then. At that point he really doesn't have a whole bunch of choice, except, as you say, to shift forces from one front to the other. That's my basic point, that the Soviets were more efficient. I don't know, we can argue all day about how efficient the British and Americans were, but I think they were certainly better supplied, right? Please. So that we can get this on tape, forgive me.
One of the issues that you've alluded to, but is critical, I think, in strategically during this period of time, is the role of logistics. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, were the Germans ever going to have enough logistics to fight on either side and win?
Well, no, the basic problem that Germany has is no matter how good they are at designing and fighting, they don't have enough raw materials and they don't have enough labor to produce sufficient weapons and supplies to keep them going. You're absolutely right. And so the more troops you send to the front, their only alternative is, I hate to say this, go to slave labor. Not just Jewish slave labor, but captured Soviet citizens and POWs put to work. And so you're right, they just do not have the resources to do what they need to do logistically. Yeah, you still need stuff. And from the very, Albert Speer, who was a minister of armaments from 42 to 45, says, now you have to be careful, Speer usually told us what we wanted to hear, but he says that they would have run out of raw materials in another 6 months even if we had not occupied Germany. Yeah. Tom.
You said that the German High Command should have anticipated the problems of terrain and weather that they would face, but didn't. They should have anticipated the problem of the Soviets' greater numbers, but didn't. I wondered if they considered or planned for or anticipated the challenges of partisan warfare that they would face in the Soviet Union.
I think they definitely did not anticipate the challenges of partisan warfare. You're absolutely right about that one. When they first entered the Soviet Union, as many of you know, a number of the minorities, Belarusians, Latvians, Estonians, Cossacks, Ukrainians, were very unhappy with Soviet rule, and had they been treated properly, they might have gotten better. As it was, a certain number of them were recruited to the German side, but the German treatment of them as being basically just occupied people did not help. Let's put it that way. And it sort of provoked, even before Moscow got organized, this kind of partisan warfare in the rear areas, which makes it very hard to move everything or do anything. Yeah. Thank you for your attention, folks. Oh, I forgot to mention here. Let's see if I can get it back up again. How did this happen? Yeah, that's what we need to have up. The next slide, but I don't know if it'll work for me. Our next speech.
Okay, you
There
have
we
to
go.
look pretty quickly, but this is what we're going to do next month. We hope you'll come out. We hope the weather will be better, and thanks again for coming today.
Yeah.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. If I can just get this super duper fancy.
Is that yours?
It's my brand new computer and I can't make